Our next topic is unlocking AI's potential in critical infrastructure. We have two amazing speakers from the United States Department of Homeland Security joining us virtually from Washington, D.C., Uttara and Matthew. Welcome, please. Uh, you're very welcome to World Summit AI. Uttara. Oh, we do
Thanks
have them.
so much,
We do have you
Jonathan.
there, Uttara and Matthew?
Yes,
Yes, I should
can
Yeah.
you
probably
hear me?
introduce you correctly. So, Uttara Sivaram is Senior Counselor to the Secretary of Artificial Intelligence. Um, we're very welcome. Apologies for the mix up there, just a slight change in the scheduling. Please go ahead with your talk. You're very welcome.
Perfect. And I want to make sure, Matt, you can
Can you hear
introduce
me?
yourself.
Matthew, you can hear.
Hi,
We're all
everyone.
good. Yeah, thank you.
I'm Matthew Ferraro. I'm also Senior Counselor and Executive Director for the AI Safety and Security Board, which we're going to talk about. Back to you, Uttara.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And thank you, Jonathan. Thanks to the World Summit team. And thank you to the Qatari Ministry for inviting us to what looks like a really spectacular event. So we wish we could be with you all in person, but we're grateful that we could start and present remotely. So I'll start with a high-level overview of AI in critical infrastructure and how we think about risk. And then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Matthew Ferraro, to discuss the framework that we recently developed and published in close consultation with the AI Safety and Security Board. Next slide, please.
Can you see slide 2, Uttara, or would you like slide 3?
Can we go to the next slide? Or is that?
What
Yes, there we go. Sorry.
number 3? Sure.
So critical infrastructure, it's defined differently in different countries, but typically it consists of the physical and digital assets that are necessary for our way of life. So the 16 sectors listed on this slide, let's see, I think one slide back.
All right, number 2. Slide 2. We're now,
Perfect.
I can ask you this, US, the
So
16.
yes, so the 16 sectors uh, listed here they're part of a complex interconnected ecosystem where any threat to these sectors could have serious consequences for our national security, our economy, public health, their safety. So the Department of Homeland Security, where Matt and I work, we're tasked with protecting critical infrastructure, and we do this by coordinating federal efforts, establishing national priorities, and continually evaluating risks, including the risks and the opportunities presented by AI. Next slide, please. So earlier this year, DHS through CISA, our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS, we evaluated risks associated with each sector's adoption of AI, and we produced a report that synthesizes cross-sector trends and takeaways. So the graph on the right, it provides some examples of the kinds of AI use cases that we're seeing across sectors. And this is important really for anchoring, any sort of risk management strategy. But what we found is, they're largely supporting functions that were already partially automated or that we're using technology that now make it conducive to incorporate AI. We also found, though, that we see a growing adoption of AI for more complex tasks, logistics, supply chain management, cyber defense. And these are suited for advances in generative AI. So, as with so many technological advances, right? Like what's at the frontier, there's typically a lag between what's happening at the frontier of innovation and when that meets industry and when industry has the opportunity to really reap the benefits and adapt it to their use cases. And I think that lag is useful because it allows research and risk management and preparation to make sure that AI is deployed safely. Next slide, please. So understanding the full risk landscape here, though, it requires an understanding of risks at each of the layers of the AI supply chain, which is pictured to the left. Now, I've seen a lot of diagrams that break down the AI supply chain, and there are many ways to do it. But I think the important thing to note here is that critical infrastructure deployers of AI, so energy utilities, railway operators, they're typically using sort of they're in the top 3 buckets where they're using model hubs, platforms, applications, and services that are built on top of the large AI models. But some deployers in critical infrastructure, so think of banks and pharmaceutical companies and many companies that are represented here today, they're building their own specialized models. And from a risk management perspective, the lines are blurring between developer and deployer, and we're seeing so much increased configurability in these AI products, which is fantastic. But we also want to make sure that we don't see sort of a diffusion of responsibility when it comes to safety and security. So, our approach is to say, if we can address risk at each of these layers and the interactions between layers, including at the application layer that's closest to the consumer or closest to the end product, we can help organizations build a more effective risk management strategy depending on where they fall in this chain. Next slide, please. So here are some additional factors that we've had to consider. So we touched on the first briefly, that AI adoption in critical infrastructure is growing, but it's uneven across sectors. So with certain sectors being more mature than others when it comes to adoption of AI. AI requires significant power, compute, data, software. This audience, knows this well, and this largely involves the IT, manufacturing, and energy sectors. It's important to note here that critical infrastructure, how they're defined in the US, they both produce and consume AI services. So we need to think about these sort of interdependencies. And so we also I touched on the fact that current AI use cases may not resemble future use cases. So today's risk management practices, they have to address the current set of risks, but also anticipate how those risks will change and evolve with time. Relatedly, AI extends the reach of current threats, like AI-enabled cyber attacks, and it introduces net new threats, like AI being used to accelerate research in sensitive fields. So, we have existing risk frameworks that we can update for, cyber resilience, but we may need new ones to address some of these emerging threats that we're seeing. All of this points to an evolving risk landscape that's still sort of coming into view. We won't know how these capabilities of these, powerful models will translate necessarily into concrete harms until we have more real-world data on how AI models perform in different contexts. And importantly, making sure that policymakers have access to that information and understand real-world performance. Next slide, please. So this leads me to the AI Safety and Security Board, which was established by the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Mayorkas, which brings together leaders from the organizations on the right to advise on how interventions across the AI supply chain that we talked about a few slides before, compute providers, hardware providers, AI developers, other tech providers, how they can help mitigate risks, downstream risks of AI deployment. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt to talk about sort of how we've worked with this board to really evaluate and produce useful guidance that sort of addresses this important risk landscape.
Thanks so much, Uttara, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. Good afternoon in Qatar, good morning here in the United States. So one more thought before you leave the slide. I would just like to point out that, of course, this board is established by the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, and our focus, of course, is U.S. Homeland Security. But the remit is much broader than that. And I would note in particular that all these companies and many of these institutions on the right, they go far beyond the national borders of the United States. So whether it's Amazon or Alphabet, Google, or Microsoft, OpenAI, and so forth. So really, by bringing all of these folks into the tent with us, I think we're able to help develop guidance that is useful, not just domestically, but internationally. And so the board is composed of the leaders of these 23 groups, and we were able to bring together across the entire supply chain that Uttara mentioned before. So what is the origin of the framework, this document that came out in November? So as Uttara noted, America's critical infrastructure sectors are increasingly deploying AI to improve the services they provide, build resilience, and counter threats. Vulnerabilities introduced by the implementation of AI exposes critical systems to failure or manipulation by nefarious actors, which can cause major disruptions across interconnected systems. In light of that, the AI board identified the need for clear guidance on how each layer of the AI supply chain can do its part to ensure that AI is developed and deployed safely and securely. So based on the facts as we have developed them, the board came to the conclusion that this kind of guidance would be useful. So the framework was developed, and the framework itself is called the DHS Roles and Responsibilities Framework for Artificial Intelligence and Critical Infrastructure. We get paid by the syllable. And it's the culmination of considerable dialogue and debate among the board and reflects its members' own real-world experiences developing, deploying, and promoting the responsible use of AI. And so it was something that the department wrote in consultation, close consultation. Uttara and I got very familiar with these folks over the past year as we developed this product from May until launch in November. So I want to pause here on the types of risks that the framework addresses. And they're risks in the context of threats, hazards, vulnerabilities, and consequences to critical infrastructure. There are a number of threat vectors, and then there's a number of, then there's the scale of the consequences of the risks. So the threat vectors are attacks using artificial intelligence, attacks targeting artificial intelligence systems, and the design and implementation failures of AI systems. And then there's the scale of consequences. There's asset level risk, which would be the lowest, sector risk, cross-sector and systemic risk, and nationally significant risk. This slide goes a bit more into detail on those risks. Asset level risks includes, but is not limited to, the disruption of or physical damage to the operation of assets or systems of a critical infrastructure or a direct supplier resulting from high risk use of AI. Examples would include the design or deployment of flaws that affect service to a population or locality. Real lay terms, think of like a single power plant. Right? Power systems are critical infrastructure. A single power plant has a major flaw and stops working. Sector risk includes, but is not limited to, risks to a set of assets impacting sector operations beyond an individual asset. These examples would include operational failures of AI systems deployed in energy or water utilities, interruptions in the provision of vital services, or the targeting of election infrastructure. In lay terms, not just a single power plant, but a power grid, say, would go down. That would be a sector risk. Systemic and cross-sector risks include, but are not limited to, disruptions to a single sector from AI-enabled cyber attacks that restrict access to critical services provided by other sectors, incidents resulting from significant financial loss, errors in AI-enabled sensing technology, disruptions in logistics supply chains due to failures in enhanced AI processes. Perhaps the electrical grid system goes down because of a failure in AI-enabled sensor on the grid system, and that sensor is in other systems. It's also in water systems, and therefore that causes a downturn to the water system in addition to the electrical system. So it is a cross-sector risk. And then nationally significant risks include, but are not limited to, risks of AI causing widespread impacts to safety or rights. And this includes assisting with the development, manufacture, or deployment of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, known by the acronym of CBRN. So that, of course, is a rather existential risk of really significant, nationally significant danger were that to occur. So those are sort of the risks as we scope them. And now we have an overview of the roles and responsibilities as defined in the framework. And so I want to point your attention first to the sort of groups of responsibilities along the top row there, that top axis. And then the responsibilities are broad. They're about three dozen or so responsibilities, but they factor into these large buckets: securing environments, driving responsible model design, implementing data governance, ensuring safe and secure deployment of AI systems, and monitoring the performance and impact of those AI systems. And we essentially clustered those responsibilities by player in a way in which have mirrored their role in the supply chain. So while cloud and compute infrastructure providers have responsibilities across all of those major areas, they really focus on securing environments, driving responsible model design. AI developers, not surprisingly, a lot of their responsibilities focus on driving responsible model design and implementing data governance. Critical infrastructure owners and operators, because they are at the tip of the spear, they deploy these models, they focus on ensuring safe and secure deployment and monitoring performance and impact. And in civil society and public sector, which we're also members of the board, representatives of those groups, and included in our framework for responsibilities, they have responsibilities that span basically all of these responsibilities. We want public sector to be champions of implementing AI responsibly. We want them to have governance models that reflect the role of government to ensure that AI is used safely and securely in a way that respects rights. And we want the civil society to work with industry and government to, among other things, help produce frameworks and metrics that can help these players measure their impacts on valuable civil rights and the like. I'll give a brief overview of these responsibilities. So cloud and compute infrastructure providers, we want them to secure environments used to develop and deploy AI, vet hardware and software suppliers, institute strong access management, protect physical data centers, monitor for anomalous activity, among many others. AI developers, we want them to implement strong privacy practices, conduct evaluations for and test for bias, failure modes, and vulnerabilities, support independent assessments for models that present heightened risks to critical infrastructure, and many others. Critical infrastructure owners and operators, we want them to engage in standards development, drive research on AI evaluations that consider critical infrastructure use cases, that is the cases in which their AI is actually used in critical infrastructure, and inform the values and safeguards shaping AI development. Civil society, I mentioned this a moment ago, we want them to engage on standards development, drive research on AI evaluations that consider critical infrastructure use cases, and inform the values and safeguards that shape AI development. Finally, the public sector, we want this public sector to support the use of AI to improve public services, advance standards of practice through statutory and regulatory action, and promote international cooperation. And here we are talking about it at the World AI Summit. So that is an overview. Of course, there are many more in the document itself. Let me talk for a moment about framework adoption. The framework reinforces the essential role of organizations in driving AI safety and security across the ecosystem. This is not an individual responsibility, and this is not purely a government responsibility. This is an organizational responsibility. It provides a model for organizations to be accountable to one another through contracts, policies, and open source platforms. And there are many forms of accountability, of which regulation is only one, that should not needlessly hamper innovation. Just want to underscore that. We think that this is a good example, this framework, of the kind of accountability mechanism that can be implemented to further its goals without hampering the innovation that is so important in this technological field. The more cloud infrastructure providers, AI developers, critical infrastructure owners and operators, civil society organizations, and state and local governments who endorse and implement this framework, the more reliable our essential services will become. That is our theory of the case, and we believe it to be true. Developers, deployers, users, critical infrastructure owners and operators, civil rights groups, and public sector officials should review the framework and adopt its recommendations where relevant to help build a future safer for us all. And our big ask, please visit dhs.gov/AI for more. You can read the framework. You can read about the initiatives that we're undertaking. The road ahead. The board will continue to develop recommendations to help critical infrastructure stakeholders, such as transportation service providers, pipeline and power grid operators, and ISPs more responsibly leverage AI technologies. The board will also develop recommendations to prevent and prepare for AI-related disruptions to critical services that impact national or economic security, public health, or safety. DHS looks forward to engaging with international partners on the recommendations outlined in the framework, which, while developed primarily for a domestic audience, as I noted, can help advance the safety and security in critical services internationally, including cross-border infrastructure. And with that, we will take questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you so much, Uttara. I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask, Uttara, if you don't mind, if we start with you, are there certain areas of critical infrastructure that still that are going to be adopting AI much quicker than others?
Yeah, I mentioned that before, that there's definitely sort of an uneven adoption, and we see, certain providers that have been using technology for longer, like, financial providers. They are, pretty sophisticated and sort of building the technology as well as building the applications on top of sort of the base model. So, um, you know, that's useful because and part of our role is to make sure that there are lessons learned, that we can take a blueprint from the financial sector or from the healthcare sector that are doing incredible things with protein discovery through AI and material science and materials discovery. Like, these are it's so useful to use these as blueprints for other sectors, in water, potentially in energy, to sort of learn from those use cases and become more mature as well, when it comes to AI and sort of tech.
Great. And Matthew, presumably some of the infrastructure you're listing there is public-private, either co-owned or has a good mix of non-governmental service providers. How do you maintain that integrity of data and processes when you're dealing with critical infrastructure that also has a third party involved?
That's a really good question. I think there are a couple ways. One is if the government is involved, say as a purchaser, the government can do things in terms of its procurement power to require certain standards be adopted and actions be taken by a service provider, by the private sector. There are, of course, mechanisms like the one that we just laid out, which is essentially a voluntary recommendation that people adopt because it's in their interest. It's in both the interest of society, but also their private interest, so as to avoid things like litigation risk and other kinds of regulatory risk. But I think it makes it all the more complicated because I think the statistic is something like 85% of all critical infrastructure in the United States is owned by the private sector.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a particular U.S. issue. And so I think that does give rise to why the kind of work that this board has been doing is important, because it basically brings the people to the table who are going to be the ones who actually have to do the work to implement it.
Yeah.
And hence, I think that's why a framework like this can be quite useful.
Absolutely. I can see why you need it, because it sounds like it can be very complicated. So I think you need the long title. Thank you so much for joining us, and a big round of applause, please, for Uttara Sivaram and Matthew Ferraro from the United States Department of Homeland Security. Thank you so much for joining us.